Hi, it's Jen with Astrology. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing our series on serial killers, and today we're going to be talking about John Wayne Gacy. And this is part 2. So John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer back in, I think it was the 80s, 70s to 80s. He was born March 17th, 1942, and he died May 10th, 1994. So the first thing that I picked up when I looked at his chart, which this is his chart here, so he had a new moon when he was born. It was a new moon in Pisces that was in his 4th house. So not only was this a new moon, but it was a solar eclipse. So that makes it that much more intense and meaningful. Then we want to look at, you always want to start with the top 3. So we want to look at the sun, moon. So those are easy. They're right together. Solar eclipse, new moon. And then we have his AC, which was in Sagittarius in his first, at 1 degree of Sagittarius. So the ruler, we want to look at then the ruler. So the ruler of Sagittarius is Jupiter. So Jupiter, you can see, is in his 7th house, and that is in an opposition. So, he might have had some issues, some back and forth with relationships, companionships. So there might have been a little bit of friction there because of that opposition with the ruler of his ascendant and the ascendant itself. So then we move on and we look again at that sun-moon conjunction in Pisces, the new moon. That's in the 4th house. So when someone's born with that that placement, they are kind of burdened with things from the past coming up. Those, if it's in the 4th house, it's those parental influences. It's that upbringing that really can come back and affect your life over and over again. His AC, again, the ascendant at 1 degree, and the new moon in this chart shows that it's very mutable. So, AC is in a mutable sign of Sagittarius. We have sun, moon, and Mercury in the mutable sign of Pisces. Then we have Jupiter. We even have Lilith and Mars in the mutable sign of Gemini. And then finally up here in Virgo, the last mutable sign, we have Neptune, his MC, and his North Node. So he's very heavy with mutable energy. So it kind of made it a little bit easier for him, to kind of, go with the flow. So he has, that Jupiter and Mars and Lilith in the 7th house, the mutable Gemini. Lilith is those sexual taboos. She's stuck in that 7th house. Found that very interesting. So this chart is mainly a mutable earth chart. It also has air and water, mutable air and water prominent, but because the MC up here in Virgo, I kind of gave that one an extra point. So I kind of feel that it's a mutable earth chart. So that main thing in that chart is going to be Mercury. So that's kind of going to be like almost like the chart rulers. We have Jupiter as the ascendant ruler, and then we have kind of like that chart feel of that Mercury. So again, back to that new moon in Pisces. So we want to look at the parental influences and see, what was brought with him into his life from this new moon, this solar eclipse, throughout life. So we want to look, the parental influences are, the father, who's represented by the 4th house. 4th house ruler would be Jupiter. And then the mother is represented by the 10th house, and the 10th house is Virgo, so she would be represented by Mercury. So Jupiter here, we have 4 houses away from pretty much the 4th house. So it's 4th from the 4th, and that's his dad. So Jupiter represents dad. we see that like communications, etc., with the father was a huge influence on his home life. Was a huge, we have that communication. We have that, up here with the communication, the fourth house, like that bond, and they're square to each other. So there's an issue there. So we have the ruler and the house placement in a square to each other. So again, kind of that uncomfortable, rough energy. So this could be, kind of what, maybe his father one day had a good day, one day was a bad day. This is in Gemini, so we know Geminis can be very opinionated. They tend to be unsympathetic. What I've read about his dad is that he was an alcoholic. So you think, fourth house, Pisces. Pisces does represent addiction. It can represent substance abuse, alcoholism, and he was cruel to his son. He was cruel, called him sissy, and probably other, emasculating names. And Gacy never felt good enough, but longed for that connection with his father. He longed to have that connection. But you see, because it's in opposition with his ascendant, and it's in a square, because Jupiter over here, it's in opposition with his ascendant, and it's in square with his sun and moon. There's issues there. There's a lot of issues there. There's a lot of tension going on between father and son. So next, let's look at mom. So mom is represented by Virgo in the 10th house up here, which is Mercury. So Mercury is here in the 4th house. So she was that calming force. She was a good support system. She was the one that kind of kept things in balance a little bit. He also has Venus here in Aquarius. That represents his siblings. So Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. That's in his 5th house of Taurus. Venus is in here, and so that's what you would call I can't even think of the word, mutual reception. So that means so we have the ruler in one and the ruler of the other. So we have the ruler of Aquarius over here in Taurus, and the ruler of Taurus over here in Aquarius. So that is a very nice, that's also it's in dignity. So because of that mutual reception. So we know that his relationships with his mother and his, I think they were 2 sisters, were good relationships. They helped him. They were his sounding board. He could sit and talk with them. So he had that good relationship and that support system, even though his father was kind of the bad in his. So let's look at more dignities and abilities. So we have the mutual reception, so that's very nice. So Mercury, who kind of, is the feel of the chart, that mutable earth. Mercury is the ruler of Gemini. So Jupiter is in detriment in Gemini. So that representation of his father, again, there's more negativity. And it makes a lot of sense. So not only is it square with his sun moon, opposition to his ascendant, it's in its detriment. So lots of issues that are going to keep popping back with the treatment of his father and the relationship he had with his father. Mercury, unfortunately, is in its fall in Pisces. So kind of unlike what we talked about last week with Jeffrey Dahmer having a lot of planets in dignity, his is not. So he doesn't have a lot of that. But that mutable energy, he was able to kind of go with the flow, clean up those loose ends, and face and deal with what was happening around him. We saw this again with Jeffrey Dahmer too, where Jeff Dahmer had a lot of mutable energy. So I guess, it's good to have a lot of mutable energy that go with the flow, that cleanup crew, that finishing up things, finalizing things. You have to have that mentality to murder people and clean up the murders afterwards. I guess that makes sense, right? You know, because if you're just all cardinal signs, cardinal people, they don't always finish what they start. So, you know, you have dead bodies laying everywhere. And anyway, so let's talk about some important transits. So we're going to mainly look at the solar arc. So we talked about solar arcs again last week. I'm just gonna refresh a little bit. So a solar arc is 1 degree per year. So for every year of life, it goes up 1 degree. So for instance, his ascendant was at 1 degree of Sagittarius. So by the time he's 29 years old, it's at the next sign. So we know if we look at his chart and someone's doing like a quick chart reading and we pull up a chart of just a random person, we can kind of look and see like, oh, well, when you're 29, something kind of big happens in your life, you know, and kind of point out those things. Well, so in his chart, at about 18, 19 years old, he started having these sexual experiences. The first one I read about was that, so he worked at a mortuary or a funeral home, and they at one point caught him in a coffin with a dead, I think it was a teenage boy, just kind of cuddling with him. This was in his workplace. He also, in this year, he had his first gay sexual experience. So this was happening when his Jupiter solar arc went into his 8th house. So when you think 8th house, you think taboos, you think sexuality and kind of that experimentation with sexuality. So this is when things really started to turn for him and change. So about 1972, the solar arcs are making a lot of changes. So beginning with the first murder in 1972, we can see these changes happening. So at this time, his ascendant is moving into Capricorn. So it's going from and moving in, so he's around 30 years old at this time. So he was born in 42, now at 72, this is 29, 30. So it's moving into Capricorn. So that is foundation. So then we also have, at the same time, his Mercury, which was, I'm just looking at my notes, which was at 0 degrees of Pisces when he was born, and that is moving into Aries. So, and Aries is in his 5th house, that's that playful creativity, kind of that dating, and then we also have Pluto that was at 3 degrees of Leo, moving into, so it's a little bit later or a little bit earlier that happened, but you can see how this starts transitioning around this time in his life and around the 27 to 30 years of age when he really starts to change. So Pluto is moving into Virgo. So he's making plans, he's actively changing to fulfill his desires. So making plans, that's the Pluto into Virgo. To fulfill his desires, that is that Jupiter into, the Mercury moving into Aries. And then, of course, the AC moving into Capricorn, that's the foundation. So he's building upon this. So building upon and becoming what that faces to the world. Capricorn, that's kind of getting things started. It's that earthy foundation. Aries is acting without regard, and Virgo is the planning and the cleanup. So we have kind of that, that cardinal energy with Capricorn and Aries, and then we have that mutable energy. So it goes from, start to finish. So he's, completing things. He gets things started, he initiates things, and then he completes them. So, fixing, tying up those loose ends at the end, which, what we know about him, he tried to tie up the loose ends as much as possible. So the AC is that face he puts forward. He looked very serious. If you look at pictures of him, he looked very serious. He was very steady. He had, that, big build. He tried to look like, he put out that persona of that really steady, serious, he was into, what do you call it, politics. So he, that the moral, compass was there, that's trying to show like that he had this good, reputation, and tried to have, really convey that good reputation out in the world. So Mercury, then we have that, that trickster, that conformist, that communicator, playful and youthful, going into his fifth house. That, and then the Pluto and Virgo kind of completing that transformation to the point of no return. So in 1975, that's when this clown persona that he has, that he's very famous for, starts to come out. So again, look at that Mercury in the fifth house. You think playful, you think youthful, clowns, that's what comes to mind. So then, you see that politics, and then, with his AC just starting in Sagittarius, he was very likable. He was fun-loving. People liked him. He got along with people well. So he was able to move up in the ranks in, I guess, the Democratic Party, where he was, really supportive of the Democrats. Even when I think of the Democratic Party, I think very mutable. Like, they really want change. They want to kind of go with the flow, button up loose ends. They want to make that change, or conservatives, even when you think of just the, conservative name, they're a little more conservative. So you could see that almost democratic, liberal side of him in his chart. Very big on his convictions. His MC was also in Virgo. When we're going back to his natal chart, looking at it, he had that reputation of that hard worker. He was a good man. The ruler, though, was that Mercury, that trickster, Mercury and Pisces, that smoke and mirrors. His natal Mercury, it's kind of smoke and mirrors, that scheming, there's no boundaries. So you thought you knew him, but you really didn't. You thought that he was this, like, kind of Virgoan, planning, which he did, the things that he did. He would convince these young boys to come to his house and do work. Here's the work that you're going to be doing, but he was not being honest with them, and he would, trick them because of that kind of smoke and mirrors type of energy that he had going on with that. He could talk to something, he could convince somebody of something, but it wouldn't necessarily be true. That's that, Mercury and Pisces, kind of like that blurring the lines. So again, that fourth house, it figures prominent with that, sun and moon, and then we have, it takes place, all this stuff that he did took place in his home. So all this focus down here, he would get these boys to come to his house, he would convince them with this Mercury to do these chores for him, to come to his home, and then he would kill them. And then he ended up burying them under the house. So again, very home related. Everything in that home is just coming back, the problems from the past. The home is very represented. It's not the same home, but it's still his home life. So everything is very revolved around his home. So sun, moon, Mercury, all very about his home, and everything that's going on with him is going on in his home. So another thing with the fourth house that I found pretty interesting is, so the IC is opposite polar to the MC. The MC is the highest point in the chart, and the IC is the lowest point in the chart. So the IC can also, they say, can represent death. So I don't see how, death couldn't be more represented by the fourth house with, death happening constantly in this house with so many young men being murdered. So much death, that new moon, you know, seeds being planted and things starting and then starting and starting, and it was just this vicious cycle. So moving on to the day of his execution. So this was on May 10th, 1994. And here's what I find fascinating about his chart is that there was a solar eclipse on that day, and it was in Taurus at 19 degrees of Taurus. Now, so he not only was born on a solar eclipse, but he died on a solar eclipse. And this solar eclipse just happened to be in a close conjunction in the sixth house, his Taurus sixth house, with his Saturn. I think he was at, let me look at my notes. So his Saturn was at 24 and the eclipse was at 19 degrees. So it was pretty close. It was, you know, an applying aspect. So, you know, things were happening. And when you think Saturn, you think endings. So can't have more of an ending than death, right? So in his natal chart, again, you know, because the nodes were in that proximity, was under a solar eclipse. So when you go back to, you know, people born under a solar eclipse, they can lead chaotic lives. So I would think his life was pretty chaotic when you think about it. You know, he did, you know, go through, you know, got these boys, killed them, or young men even. They were mostly, I think, young men, teenagers, older teenagers. But it's still chaotic. There's always something that he's got to be cleaning up after. You know, the bodies under the house that he's burying in his crawl space underneath his house. So a lot of people that are born with this moon phase can live these chaotic lives, going through lots of transformations. And when you look at his life, you know, going from, you know, this kind of mentally abused child to, you know, growing up, he did get arrested when he was, I think, in his early 20s for molesting somebody. Then he did this clown persona. He had so many different outer personas. So, you know, he wanted to be kind of a leader. He wanted to fit in. You know, that Sagittarius ascendant makes him, you know, extremely likable, extremely, you know, that personable. If you know anyone that's a Sagittarius, they just love life and everything about it. So, you know, that's what he wanted to perceive to the world, but it wasn't obviously much like that. Kind of to sum up, born and dead during solar eclipses, the fourth house showing death. So perhaps that solar eclipse in his fourth house kind of foreshadowed the solar eclipse that was going to be there when he was killed, or not killed, but put to death. So, and that eclipse almost conjunct his natal Saturn. Taurus, that's the end, it's the ground, that's the ending. So that's John Wayne Gacy. I hope you enjoyed it. I found him to be very fascinating, or I found his chart to be very fascinating. It's so funny how things are spelled out. And now this little child was born, and you look at it and you don't necessarily think you would see that. You know, it's obvious that there might be some issues with his father, but you see, you know, mother and siblings are going to have a good relationship, but you never see this stuff coming. So again, it doesn't matter if you have a ton of dignities, debilities in your chart. It depends on how you use them. So you want to use them a little wiser than John Wayne Gacy. Kind of work with them instead of letting them control your life. So be sure to hit the subscribe button, because we have more coming up of our true crime series this season. Next we have coming up is Ted Bundy. So make sure you hit that notification bell. Also, come back and visit us for our weekly astrology forecast. And another thing, definitely check out my website, Astrology at astrotastrology.net, or contact me at astrotastrology@gmail. I know I've talked about this in past videos. Been really fine-tuning that Virgo energy, fine-tuning my tarot practice and getting really good. I'd love to give y'all a little quick 3-card reading, so contact me for that. You can hit the contact me button on my website and you can see all the different options for readings, tarot readings, astrology readings, all that. So I hope to hear from y'all soon, and I will, remember, hit the subscribe because we got more coming up, and have a good week. Bye-bye.